Hello again, sharks. Today we'll be covering our second video. We'll be covering three topics, that is space, lanes, and clogging. So before we talked about separation, today we're talking about spaces, lanes, and clogging. A space, or space, is an empty area of field where there are no defenders. In this case, the space is pretty easy to find when we draw our defender's circle of influence. The whole rest of the field is space. There's only one defender. Move out of the circle of influence into space, and you're open for a pass. It gets a little more complicated when there are more defenders. But if we draw their circles of influence, we can now figure out where the space is. There's space in the end zone, and there's space over here on the sideline. Our end zone space is a tougher throw, so let's not worry about it for right now. That leaves us with this sideline space. Create separation, move into that space, and receive your easy pass. Of course, defenders are not stupid. They know where the space is, and they're probably going to move over there to cover you, to stand between you and the space where you want to be. So we'll use our cutting techniques like we talked about in the first video to create separation in the space. And that's the best way to get the disc. Push them out of the way and cut back in to create your separation in space to catch your easy pass. Lanes are avenues or alleys or tunnels, if you could think of them that way, that the disc can pass through without getting nailed by another player, by a defender. Let's draw our lanes to show you what I'm talking about. Our first lane passes very narrowly through these two defenders. Our second lane goes out to the left of the handler. And our third largest lane goes out to the right of the handler. Each of these are free areas where you can throw the disc through. Now let's talk about which one of these are viable lanes, if any. First, we can draw circles of influence. You can see our first lane here, our middle lane, is narrow and passes through two circles of influence. That's a really tough shot. It's not really a viable option except for the very, very strongest of handlers, and even then only in a desperate situation. So let's not worry about it. Our second lane passes through a circle of influence. Not a huge deal, but also doesn't end in space. You can see there's a defender right at the end of the lane waiting for anybody to move in there. So let's not worry about that lane. Our third lane out to the right doesn't pass through any circles of influences, has no defenders there, and has lots of space open for it. That's going to be our most viable lane. We have a lane and space. That's an optimal passing opportunity. Now, your defenders aren't stupid. They know where the lanes are. They know where the space is. So let's put it all together. Let's cut to create our separation into a space that has a lane. Drive our defender out and cut back. That is the most basic of all cuts. Sometimes it'll get a little more complicated. Here's another situation where we have a few more defenders and only one cutter. There's the circle of influence of our two extra defenders. We won't draw the circle of influence for the guard covering our cutter and for the marker covering our handler because they're not involved in the same way as these two free defenders. So we have space back here. We have space over here. We have a small space here. And we have a very small space here. Those are the spaces that are outside of circles of influence. Now where are our lanes? We have a big lane here. And this is technically one lane, but it was hard to draw, so we drew it as two. So we have this wide lane here, and we have a very small lane coming out to that circle of influence, or that space. You'll notice our space in the top right of the end zone doesn't really have a lane going towards it. That means it's not a viable space. It's not useful. It's nice and open and no one's there, but the handler can't throw there because he doesn't have a lane. So we'll get rid of it. That leaves these 3 spaces, which each have lanes. So let's show you an example of how to get into each of these spaces. This is our first space. This would be for a short swing pass. This is the case of a weak handler, or a handler with a high stall count where you need a reset. So let's pull our defender away from where we want to be and cut back into our space. Pretty simple. The next case is where we want to go deep into the end zone. We'll take use of this large backspace here. Let's pull our defender away and cut in towards that space to receive our pass. We may have been able to get a little more out of that and get a score out of it, but in this case, we'll settle for the huge distance gain. Now let's talk about this small space over here to the right, this third space. It's a very small space with a very small lane jabbed against the sideline. It doesn't seem like a great option, but I'll show you why it is. First, we'll make our cut down here to drive our defender out of the way. We'll cut right across the handler to receive our pass. Now, we're the new handler, and we can redraw some of our lanes and some of our spaces. But I'm not going to redraw all of them. I just want you to notice that this lane and this space open up. So if we had another cutter, he could immediately cut into this space, open for a pass in the end zone. Now we're on to clogging. Clogging is something that new players do all the time, and veterans players can't stand. Clogging is standing in a lane, even if you think you're wide open, and literally creating a wall in the middle of that lane and shutting it down. In man-to-man defense, you're almost never by yourself. So if you think you're by yourself, you may want to look around. Your defender may be behind you. Let's show you what it looks like. In this case, our cutter attempts to make a cut into space, into a lane, but doesn't do a very good job and doesn't get rid of his defender. Now, this cutter decides that he's going to stay put there and not move out of the way. He's clogging that lane. If our other cutter moves into the lane, he's wide open in space in a lane. But this defender here is shutting our whole lane down. All because our first cutter didn't move out of the way. Let's show you what it's supposed to look like. Our cutter moves in, but our defender stays right with him. You need to immediately recognize that you're not going to win this disc. This defender beat you. It's okay. Get over it. Let's get out of the way and try again. We'll move out of the way, out of the lane, out of the space to give our next guy an open opportunity. We'll talk more about stacks and where to go and where lanes are and how to get out of the way in practice. But for now, you can watch this video a few times or find some videos of other Ultimate games on YouTube and see what I mean about players making a cut, and if they don't win it, moving out of the way to allow someone else a turn. That's all for today.